Elijah Carter had 12 minutes to save his daughter's future, and he was about to throw them away for a stranger. The job interview at Northbridge Innovations was the only thing standing between his family and eviction. He'd prepared for 3 weeks, ironed his shirt twice that morning. In his breast pocket sat a folded crayon drawing his 8-year-old daughter Maya had pressed into his hand at the door. 2 stick figures in front of a house with a tree. Daddy's new beginning. He was going to make it. Then the rain came down hard. Traffic locked up. And on the shoulder of the highway, he spotted her. A woman visibly 8 months pregnant, soaking wet, gripping her dead car like it was the only thing holding her upright. No help coming. Every other driver slowed down, looked, and kept going. Elijah drove past her too. He got 40 yards before he glanced in the rearview mirror and watched her drop to her knees in a puddle. He had 12 minutes, 1 chance. Everything he'd worked for sitting right there in his hands. He hit the brakes, and what happened next he never could have predicted. Not in 1,000 years. If you're new here, this channel is where we tell stories about real human choices. The ones that cost something and mean something. If that sounds like your kind of thing, hit subscribe. Now let's get into it. Elijah Carter was not a man who asked for help. At 36, he had the kind of quiet resilience that doesn't announce itself. The kind built slowly in the dark when nobody's watching. He'd spent the last 3 years learning how to be 2 people at once. The father who packed Maya's lunch every morning and made sure her uniform was clean. And the man who sat at the kitchen table after she went to sleep, staring at numbers that never added up. He'd been a logistics coordinator for 7 years, good at his job, steady, reliable. Then the layoffs came, and reliable turned out to mean nothing when the company needed to cut costs fast. His name was on the first list. No warning, no severance worth mentioning. Just a cardboard box and a handshake from a manager who couldn't make eye contact. That was 14 months ago. Since then, he'd done what he had to do. Delivery driving during the day, fixing appliances and wiring for neighbors in the evenings, cash only, no questions. He kept his shirts pressed, even when his wallet was empty, because he understood something his own father had taught him. How you carry yourself is the one thing nobody can take from you. What Elijah feared most wasn't poverty. He'd grown up close enough to it to know it wasn't the worst thing. What he feared was Maya growing up believing that good people always lose. That doing the right thing was a luxury only certain people could afford. Her mother Diane had believed the opposite. She was the kind of woman who made strangers feel like old friends within 10 minutes, who remembered every birthday, who gave without keeping score. She and Elijah had met at a community center fundraiser she'd been volunteering. He'd been helping a friend set up equipment, and within 20 minutes she'd already argued with him about the most efficient way to stack folding chairs, which he later told her was the moment he knew. When she died 3 years ago, complications after a surgery that should have been routine, she left behind a grief so clean and total that Elijah still hadn't found the edges of it. What she also left behind was Maya, curious, sharp, relentlessly kind in the way that children are before the world teaches them otherwise. 8 years old, missing her 2 front teeth, absolutely certain that her father was the best man alive. Elijah spent every day trying to be worthy of that certainty. They lived in a 2-bedroom apartment on the east side of the city, the kind of building where the hallway always smelled like someone else's cooking and the ceiling developed new water stains every winter. The landlord had been patient, then impatient, and now final. The notice arrived on a Tuesday. Pay the outstanding balance within 1 week or vacate the premises. No extensions, no negotiations. Which was why Northbridge Innovations mattered so much. The company was a mid-sized tech logistics firm growing fast, with a reputation for paying well and promoting from within. The open position operations manager was exactly what Elijah had spent 7 years training for without knowing it. Good salary, full benefits, enough stability to sign a new lease somewhere with a functioning ceiling, and maybe eventually a small yard where Maya could plant something. He'd applied on a Tuesday, gotten the interview call on Thursday. Spent the following 3 weeks preparing like it was the bar exam, researching the company, rehearsing answers in the bathroom mirror, asking his neighbor Mrs. Calloway to watch Maya so he could run mock interviews alone in his car in the parking garage where nobody could hear him. The morning of Maya had been awake before him. She'd already eaten, already packed her bag for school, and when he came into the kitchen in his pressed shirt and good shoes, she was sitting at the table with a crayon and a piece of construction paper. She folded it carefully and pressed it into his breast pocket with both hands, the way you pin something important. He didn't open it until he was in the car. 2 stick figures, a house, a tree with a round top, and at the bottom in her careful, deliberate 8-year-old handwriting, Daddy's New Beginning. Elijah sat in the driveway for a moment longer than he needed to. Then he started the engine and pulled out into the morning, which was still dry and clear and full of possibility. It started raining 11 minutes later. The rain started 20 minutes into the drive. Not a drizzle, a wall. The kind of rain that turns headlights into smears and makes every driver on the highway suddenly forget how to function. Traffic that had been moving steadily ground down to a crawl, then to a stop, then to that particular misery of inching forward 10 feet at a time while the clock on the dashboard kept moving at its normal pace regardless. Elijah white-knuckled the steering wheel and did the math he didn't want to do. 18 minutes out, 14, 11. The GPS kept recalculating, kept offering him alternate routes that were somehow worse than the one he was already on. He merged right, found a lane that was moving slightly faster and told himself he could still make it. He just had to keep moving. He was down to 12 minutes when he saw her. A silver sedan pulled halfway onto the shoulder with its hazard lights blinking weakly in the downpour. And beside it, a woman visibly heavily pregnant somewhere deep in her 3rd trimester, standing in the rain with one hand braced against the driver's side door. Her other hand was pressed flat against her stomach. Her clothes were soaked through. She was holding her phone up, staring at the black screen, then lowering it again in the specific way of someone who already knows it's dead, but keeps checking out of desperation. 3 cars ahead of Elijah slowed as they passed her. None of them stopped. He told himself what every driver tells themselves in that moment. Someone else will stop. There are other people out here. She'll be fine. I can't save everyone. He pulled past her. He got about 40 yards down the road before he looked in the rearview mirror. She had let go of the car door. She was going down, not sitting, not crouching, her knees hitting the wet asphalt beside a puddle that was still spreading in the rain. Elijah's foot was on the brake before he'd made a conscious decision. The car behind him laid on the horn. He didn't move. He sat there for 2 full seconds, long enough to understand exactly what he was giving up, and then he hit his hazards, pulled onto the shoulder, and reversed. Her name was Serena Walsh. He didn't know that yet. What he knew was that she was shaking when he reached her, and that the shaking wasn't entirely from the cold. She was 8 months pregnant, she told him, voice tight and controlled in the way of someone managing pain they don't want to show. She'd been on her way to the hospital, a checkup after some abnormal readings the night before when the engine simply cut out. She'd been standing on that shoulder for nearly 20 minutes. A passing driver had rolled down his window long enough to say he'd call someone, then never did. Elijah didn't ask more questions. He got her into the passenger seat, cranked the heat, and draped his suit jacket over her shoulders before she could object. Then he pulled back onto the highway and headed toward Memorial Hospital, which was in the opposite direction from Northbridge Innovations. Serena noticed him checking the clock. She was sharper than her exhaustion suggested. "You're in a hurry," she said. "I'm fine. You keep looking at the time." He didn't answer right away. She waited. There was something about the quality of her silence that made him tell the truth, not the whole story, just enough. The interview, the job, the notice from the landlord. Maya. When he finished, Serena was quiet for a moment, then said he should drop her at the hospital entrance and go. She could get herself through the doors from there. "No," Elijah said. "I'm serious. You still have time if—" "I'm not dropping you at the curb." He kept his eyes on the road. "A job I can lose. I can find another one. What I can't do is leave someone in your situation on the side of the road and spend the rest of my life wondering what happened." He pulled up to the emergency entrance, walked her inside, and waited until a nurse had her in a wheelchair and moving through the double doors. Then he stepped back out into the rain, took out his phone, and called Northbridge. The woman in HR was polite, brief, The position had already been offered to another candidate. She wished him well. Elijah stood under the narrow overhang outside the ER, rain coming down 2 feet in front of him, suit jacket gone, shirt soaked through. He didn't move for a long time. Around him, the ordinary machinery of a hospital kept turning, families arriving, paramedics unloading a man in scrubs eating a sandwich on a bench like it was any other day. Elijah just stood there, hands in his pockets, and let the reality settle over him. He had done the right thing. It had cost him everything. He thought about going back inside to check on Serena, then decided against it. She had people now. He didn't need to be one of them. He walked back to his car through the rain and drove home to figure out what came next. He didn't tell Maya that night. When he walked through the door, she was at the kitchen table doing homework, her tongue pressed to the corner of her mouth the way it always was when she was concentrating hard. She looked up, took in his damp shirt and empty hands, and something in his face she was too young to name but old enough to recognize, and asked if he wanted her to make toast. He said yes. They ate toast together and watched half a nature documentary about migratory birds, and when she fell asleep on the couch, he carried her to bed without waking her. He stood in the doorway of her room for a moment, watching her breathe, one arm flung out to the side the way she'd always slept since she was a baby. Then he sat down at the kitchen table and looked at the landlord's notice. 72 hours. He opened his bank app, stared at the balance, closed the app. He thought about calling his cousin in Baltimore who had a couch and enough generosity to offer it, but not enough space for a man and a child to stay more than a few days. He thought about the shelter on Delaney Street that he'd once helped a former co-worker navigate. And then he stopped himself because that wasn't where they were yet, and he needed to be careful about catastrophizing. He needed to think clearly. What kept pulling him back wasn't the money. It was the drawing, the absolute uncomplicated certainty in it. Daddy's new beginning. She hadn't drawn it as a wish. She'd drawn it like she was documenting something that was already decided. He folded the landlord's notice and put it under his phone so he wouldn't have to look at it. Then he went to bed, set his alarm for 5, and lay in the dark for a long time before sleep came. He found the business card the next morning. He was emptying his jacket pockets before taking it to the dry cleaner, the jacket he'd given to Serena in the car, and there it was, tucked into the inner breast pocket. Small, cream-colored, clean serif font. Serena Walsh, founder and CEO, Northbridge Innovations. Elijah read it once, then again. He set it down on the counter and stood there looking at it the way you look at something that doesn't immediately compute, waiting for your brain to catch up with what your eyes are telling you. The woman on the side of the road, the soaked clothing, the dead phone, the shaking hands. The woman he'd driven across town to the hospital while the interview she was running went on without him. He didn't feel lucky. He wasn't sure what he felt. He picked up the card, put it in his shirt pocket, and made coffee. Northbridge called him that afternoon. An assistant professional and neutral, asking if he'd be available to meet with Ms. Walsh at his earliest convenience. The phrasing was careful in a way that made clear the convenience was mostly his. Elijah went in 2 days later, not with excitement, not with gratitude, with his guard up. He'd thought carefully about this on the drive over. He knew how this kind of story was supposed to go, the dramatic rescue, the powerful person wanting to give something back, the heartwarming resolution. He'd seen those stories. He didn't trust them. The last thing he wanted was to become someone's redemption narrative, to be handed something not because he'd earned it, but because his presence made someone feel better about themselves. If that was what this was, he needed to know immediately. Serena Walsh's office was on the 14th floor, glass-walled, with a view of the city that cost more per square foot than his apartment. She was behind her desk when he arrived, visibly closer to her due date, moving with the careful deliberateness of late pregnancy, and she stood when he came in, which he hadn't expected. She didn't open with pleasantries. She told him directly she hadn't staged anything. The car had genuinely broken down. The phone had genuinely died. She'd been standing on that shoulder for 20 minutes before he reversed. And when she returned to the office and pulled up the candidate list, she found his name, pulled his file, and read it properly for the first time. What she'd seen was solid, strong operational record, good instincts, the kind of cross-industry experience that transferred well. But there was something else she wanted to say, and she said it without dressing it up. "I watched you make a decision that cost you something real," she said. "That's not in a resume. That's not something you rehearse for an interview. I've hired a lot of people in this building, and I've never actually seen that."
Elijah listened to all of it.
Then he asked the question he'd been carrying since he found the card. "Is this because you think I'm qualified, or because you feel like you owe me something?" The office went quiet. Not uncomfortable, just still. Serena didn't flinch, but she didn't reach for a quick answer either. He watched her actually sit with the question, turning it over.
"Honestly,"
she said after a long moment, "I think it might be both. And I think you deserve to know that rather than have me pretend otherwise." It wasn't the answer he'd expected. It was somehow the only answer that would have kept him in the room.
She slid a folder across the desk.
Not the operations manager role, something new, a position she'd been turning over in her mind for months without knowing who could fill it. Director of People and Field Operations, responsible for building real infrastructure around the people Northbridge had always depended on and consistently neglected. Drivers, field technicians, warehouse staff, the people who kept the company running and got mentioned last in every all-hands meeting. Elijah opened the folder, read the first page carefully, then looked up. "If I take this," he said, "I need to be able to tell the truth, even when it's inconvenient, even when it costs the company something." Serena held his gaze without blinking. "That's exactly why I'm asking you." He took the folder home that night and read every page twice. In the morning, he called and said yes. Northbridge Innovations looked exactly like what it wanted you to think it was. The lobby had exposed brick and a living wall of plants along the east side. The kitchen on every floor was stocked with good coffee. The company website featured photographs of smiling warehouse workers and drivers alongside the executive team, everyone bathed in the same warm light, everyone apparently part of the same story. The brand language was fluent in words like community and people first and built together. Elijah had been in the building 4 days before he started noticing the gaps between the language and the reality underneath it. A driver named Raymond mentioned almost in passing that he'd been in a minor fender bender 6 months ago and discovered his coverage didn't apply during certain delivery windows, a clause buried deep enough in his contract that most drivers had never read it. A warehouse supervisor named Donna told him her team regularly ran 12-hour shifts during peak periods without proper overtime documentation because the system that logged hours had a known error that nobody had prioritized fixing. A field technician named Greg laughed a short, tired laugh when Elijah asked about the emergency contact protocol for solo night jobs.
"There isn't one,"
Greg said. "There's a number you can call, but nobody picks up after 7. None of these people were angry in the way you'd expect. That was the part that stayed with Elijah longest. They weren't organizing or preparing to walk out. They were just tired and accustomed to the kind of low-level institutional neglect that eventually stops feeling like neglect and starts feeling like weather. Just the way things work, just how it is. Elijah wrote everything down. The resistance came from Douglas Merritt, and it came in the way that experienced opposition always does. Quietly, indirectly, and with plausible deniability at every step. Merritt was Northbridge's chief strategy officer. Early 50s, silver-haired, the kind of man who'd been in the room for every major decision the company had ever made and had come to treat that history as a form of personal ownership. He'd been there when Serena founded Northbridge in a shared workspace with 4 employees and a lease signed on a handshake. He'd helped build the culture, the org structure, the brand identity. In ways that were real, even if he'd never say them aloud, the company was his life's work. Which meant Elijah Carter was a problem he couldn't afford. Not because of anything personal. Merritt didn't dislike Elijah as a man. He disliked what Elijah represented. The possibility that the systems Merritt had built and defended for years had been quietly failing the people at the bottom of them. If the drivers were underinsured and the warehouse staff were being shorted through a convenient system error, then someone had looked at those conditions and decided they were acceptable. Merritt hadn't built Northbridge through malice. He'd built it through the particular blindness of someone who measures success in revenue and growth metrics, and has spent so long in leadership meetings that the people doing the actual work have become abstractions on a spreadsheet. Elijah, arriving with a notebook and asking questions, threatened to make those abstractions human again. Merritt couldn't let that happen. He kept Elijah out of key strategy meetings under the stated reason that he was still getting oriented. He made comments to other senior staff, nothing you could quote directly, just carefully placed doubt. Serena means well, but she made an emotional decision here. Let's see if he can actually deliver. He made sure the right people understood, without being told explicitly, that the director of people and field operations was a feel-good hire rather than a strategic one. In one memorable exchange in the hallway outside the second-floor conference room, Merritt stopped Elijah to ask, with every appearance of genuine friendliness, how he was settling into the culture. When Elijah said he was spending most of his time in the field, Merritt smiled and said, "Good. That's probably where you're most comfortable." Then he walked away. Elijah stood in the hallway for a moment after that and made a note. Not of what Merritt had said, of how he'd said it. He didn't respond to any of it directly. He went back to the field instead. He spent the first 3 weeks doing almost nothing except listening. He rode along with drivers on their routes. He worked morning shifts in the warehouse. He sat in break rooms and asked questions and mostly just let people talk. He filled 2 notebooks with field observations. He mapped every operational gap he could find, not just the human cost, but the financial one. The insurance coverage lapses were creating real liability exposure. The overtime logging error was one audit away from serious legal trouble. The lack of field safety protocols had already resulted in 3 unreported incidents in the past 18 months. He also quietly and carefully began to notice something else. When he asked about certain decisions why the coverage clause was written that way when the overtime system error had first been flagged, what had happened after those 3 incidents, the answers were always the same. It was already like that when I got here. Someone higher up decided it wasn't a priority. I filed a report, but nothing came back. He started pulling on those threads. He requested old incident logs through the internal system. He asked Raymond and Donna and Greg if they'd kept any of their own records, and was surprised to find that several of them had photographs, personal notes, email screenshots saved on personal phones out of a vague sense that someone might need them someday. He gathered what he could and kept it separate from his formal proposal in a folder he didn't discuss with anyone yet. He was building 2 things at once, a case for change and a record of why change had been resisted. Through all of it, something quieter was developing in the spaces between meetings. Serena was 3 weeks from her due date, still working full days running board calls and investor meetings with the focused efficiency of someone who has decided that slowing down is not an option. She was capable and controlled, and Elijah noticed profoundly alone in the particular way that very competent people sometimes are surrounded by people who deferred to her and almost no one who pushed back. He pushed back, respectfully, consistently with data. She seemed to find it more useful than she expected, and occasionally in the brief windows between meetings, she found reasons to stop by the small conference room he'd converted into a field operations base. The wall he'd covered with maps and notes and printouts seemed to surprise her every time. Not because it was complicated, because it was real. "You actually spent time in the warehouse," she said one afternoon. Not a question, more like something she was processing. "That's where the work is," he said. She stood at the wall for a moment, reading a few of the notes. Then she said, "I haven't been down there in 8 months." She said it quietly, like she was telling herself rather than him. She left without saying anything else, but she came back the next day. Maya met Serena on a Saturday 4 weeks into Elijah's time at Northbridge. Serena had suggested through her assistant that Elijah was welcome to bring Maya by the office that weekend. She was going in to catch up on some reading. The building would be empty. Maya could draw or watch something on a tablet. It was a small gesture, the kind that costs nothing. Elijah accepted because Maya had been asking about Daddy's new job with increasing frequency, and he figured a Saturday visit to a quiet office would satisfy her curiosity. Maya walked in, looked around the 14th floor with the frank assessment of someone evaluating a potential investment, and then looked at Serena. then at Serena's very prominent stomach. "Are you scared?" she asked. "About being a mom?" Serena blinked. "Why do you ask?"
Maya thought about it.
"Because you look like you're trying not to be scared. My dad looked like that after my mom died. Like he was being really brave but also really scared at the exact same time." She paused. "He figured it out, though. He's the best dad in the whole world, so—"
Serena Walsh had sat across from investors who tried to intimidate her board members who'd underestimated her, and journalists who'd written condescending profiles with titles like, "Can she keep it up?" She had a policy about not crying in professional settings. It was a policy she'd maintained for 6 years without exception. She broke it. Quietly, briefly turning slightly toward the window, Maya, who had more emotional intelligence than most adults Elijah knew, very kindly looked down at her drawing and pretended not to notice. The proposal was ready on a Thursday, 42 pages. Operational restructuring, revised insurance coverage for all field staff and emergency protocol system for solo night jobs, a corrected overtime logging process, and a modest hardship fund for employees facing sudden crises. Every recommendation came with a cost analysis showing how the changes would reduce liability exposure and long-term operational loss. Elijah had run the numbers 4 different ways to make sure they held under scrutiny. He sent it to Serena on Thursday evening. She read it overnight and called him Friday morning to say it was the most substantive internal document she'd received in 3 years. The board presentation was scheduled for the following Wednesday. That weekend, Douglas Merritt went to work. Elijah found out on Monday from a field technician named Paul, who had overheard a conversation he wasn't supposed to hear Merritt on a phone call in the parking structure. Voice low, clearly not expecting anyone to be 3 cars away loading equipment. What Paul relayed was this: Merritt had spent the weekend calling 3 specific board members, not to discuss the proposal directly, to shape the room before the proposal could speak for itself. He'd told them that Elijah's hire had been an emotional decision made by a CEO in the final weeks of a difficult pregnancy. He described the proposal as well-intentioned, but operationally naive, written by someone without enough institutional history to understand why certain structures existed the way they did. And then he'd surfaced a logistics incident from 8 months prior, a routing failure that had resulted in delayed deliveries and a minor equipment loss, and framed it in a way that placed Elijah adjacent to the decision-making chain, even though Elijah hadn't joined the company until 4 months after the incident. It wasn't a direct accusation, just a shadow, the kind of doubt that doesn't need to be proven because it only needs to exist long enough to delay a vote. Paul told Elijah all of this in the parking lot outside the building, speaking quietly, eyes moving. He'd been at Northbridge for 4 years and had filed 2 safety complaints that went nowhere. He was done staying quiet. Elijah thanked him. Then he sat in his car for a long time. He understood what was in front of him clearly. If he walked into Wednesday's board meeting and presented the proposal without addressing any of this, Merritt's 3 allies would ask the wrong questions at the wrong moments. The vote would get tabled for further review, and the proposal would die the quiet death that inconvenient things die inside large organizations. The drivers and technicians and warehouse workers who'd trusted him enough to share their records would go back to the same conditions. Nothing would change. And Elijah would keep his job because he'd been careful enough not to become a problem. That was option 1. Option 2 was to walk into that room on Wednesday and tell the full truth, not just about the operational failures, but about how they'd been managed, concealed, and why. That meant placing the documents he'd been quietly gathering in front of the board directly. It meant becoming, in the language of every corporate environment he'd ever worked in, a disruption. And even if the evidence was solid, even if every number was right, there was a real possibility that a board looking at a man who'd been at the company less than 2 months, openly confronting its longest tenured executive, would decide the disruption wasn't worth it. He could lose the job. Not through a dramatic firing, through the slower, quieter mechanism of being made irrelevant. Moved sideways, given less access, managed out over 6 months until leaving felt like his own decision. Maya's new school enrollment,
The apartment lease they'd just signed first and last month's deposit already paid the keys sitting on his kitchen counter. The first real stability he'd had in 3 years. All of it sat on one side of the scale. He drove home that evening and made dinner. Pasta, because Maya loved it, because it was cheap, and because some nights you need something simple and reliable. After she went to bed, he sat at the kitchen table, the same table where he'd sat staring at the landlord's notice 6 weeks ago, and looked at nothing in particular for a long time. The honest thing was that he wasn't confused. He knew exactly what he was going to do. He'd known since Paul told him in the parking lot, probably since before that. The decision had already been made somewhere beneath the level of deliberate thought made by the same part of him that had reversed on the highway without waiting for his brain to catch up. What he felt wasn't confusion. It was the specific heavy weight of a man who knows what the right thing is and is still afraid of what it's going to cost him. He thought about Diane, about what she would have said. He thought about Maya's drawing still folded in his jacket pocket. He went to bed, set his alarm for 5. Wednesday was coming. The boardroom on the 14th floor had floor-to-ceiling windows on 2 sides. On a clear day, you could see straight across the city to the river. That Wednesday morning, it was overcast, flat gray light that made everything look slightly underexposed, and the 7 members of Northbridge's board of directors were arranged around the long table with the careful neutrality of people who had already been thinking about this meeting before they walked in. Elijah arrived early. He set up his materials, checked the projector connection, poured himself water he didn't drink. He'd brought 2 folders, the proposal and the separate documentation he'd been quietly building for 3 weeks. He placed them both on the table in front of him and left them there. Serena came in 5 minutes before the hour, moving carefully, one hand resting briefly on the back of a chair as she lowered herself into her seat at the head of the table. She looked at the 2 folders. Then she looked at Elijah. He held her gaze for a moment and gave the smallest nod. She understood. Douglas Merritt came in last. He took his usual seat to Serena's left, set a leather portfolio in front of him, and looked at Elijah with the pleasant, composed expression of a man who believes he has already determined how a situation will end. Serena opened the meeting and gave Elijah the floor. He presented for 18 minutes. Clean slides, plain language, no performance. He walked the board through every operational gap. He documented the insurance coverage holes, the overtime logging error, the absence of field safety protocols, the 3 unreported incidents. He presented the cost of inaction in concrete numbers, projected liability exposure, the legal risk of the next audit, the turnover cost of continuing to lose experienced field staff who left because nobody was paying attention to their working conditions. Then he walked through the proposal itself, page by page. When he finished, the room held a particular kind of silence, the kind that is deciding something. Then Arthur Tice, a board member Elijah had identified early as one of Merritt's closest allies, leaned forward and asked a question that had nothing to do with the proposal. "Mr. Carter," Tice said pleasantly, "can you clarify your involvement in the routing failure from last October? The one that resulted in the Hargrove equipment loss?" "I joined the company in February," Elijah said. "The Hargrove incident was in October of last year. I had no involvement." "There's been some suggestion," Tice continued, glancing at his notes, "that the systemic issues you're describing may have been present during decisions made in your—" "That's not accurate." Elijah said it simply, without heat. "And I think everyone in this room already knows it's not accurate." The silence that followed was a different kind. Elijah reached into the second folder and slid a set of documents toward the center of the table. "What I've also prepared," he said, "is a separate record. Not part of the original proposal. This is documentation of how several of the failures I've described were known about internally in some cases for over 2 years, and how reports flagging those failures were revised before they reached this board." He didn't say Merritt's name. He didn't need to. The documents said it. Email threads with revision histories, incident logs with timestamps, a paper trail that had been sitting in the company's own systems waiting for someone to look. The room went very still. Merritt opened his mouth. And then Serena made a sound, sharp, involuntary, and every head at the table turned. She had one hand pressed flat on the table and the other against her side, and her face had gone a particular shade that had nothing to do with the lighting. When she spoke, the control in her voice was extraordinary under the circumstances. "I need to step out," she said. What happened next took about 90 seconds and involved a great deal of chair movement, people reaching for phones, and one board member standing up and not being sure what to do with himself once he was standing. Merritt looked at his portfolio. He looked at the door. He looked at Serena. He did not move. Elijah was already at her side. He pulled her chair back, kept one hand steady at her elbow, told the board member nearest the door to call 911 right now, told the room clearly and without raising his voice that everyone needed to stay calm and give her space. Then he crouched down to Serena's eye level and spoke quietly in the same tone he'd used in a rain-soaked car 8 weeks ago on the shoulder of a highway. "I've got you," he said. "Same as last time." She exhaled, gripped his arm, nodded once. By the time the paramedics arrived 6 minutes later, Elijah had cleared the room to 2 people, kept Serena's breathing steady, and relayed her full medical history to the dispatcher with the focused efficiency of someone who has learned the hard way that staying calm in a crisis is not a feeling. It's a decision you make and keep making until it's over. The boardroom emptied out behind them. The documents were still on the table. Serena's son was born at 4:47 that afternoon. 6 weeks early, but strong. The nurses used that word twice, which Elijah later learned was their way of telling a new mother not to be afraid before she thought to ask. He was small and loud, and apparently very clear about his feelings regarding the whole experience, which the attending nurse said with a tired smile was an excellent sign. Serena named him Daniel. Elijah waited in the hospital hallway until he got the text from Serena's assistant confirming she was stable and resting. Then he drove to pick up Maya from Mrs. Calloway's, made dinner without saying much, and sat with his daughter on the couch until she fell asleep. He carried her to bed, stood in her doorway for a moment. He didn't know yet what Wednesday had cost him. He found out Thursday morning not through a phone call from HR, but through a text from Serena herself, sent from a hospital room at 6 in the morning. "Read everything. All of it. Starting the independent review today. Thank you for putting it on the table." The review took 10 days. Serena ran it from her hospital room for the first 3, then from home with Daniel in a bassinet beside her desk and a legal pad full of notes on her lap. People who worked with her said later that she seemed somehow more focused in those 10 days than they'd seen her in years. Like something that had been weighing on her for a long time had finally been named, and naming it was a relief, even when the name was hard. What the review found was consistent with everything Elijah had documented: a pattern of selectively revised incident reports, suppressed field complaints, and operational decisions made to protect short-term performance metrics at the direct expense of the people generating them. The review found that Douglas Merritt had been the consistent point of intersection across every instance, not through dramatic wrongdoing, but through the quieter, more corrosive practice of deciding year after year that the people at the bottom of the org chart didn't need to be told the truth about their own conditions. Merritt submitted his resignation before the board could formalize the conversation. He left on a Friday afternoon with a box and a brief letter citing personal reasons. Elijah heard about it from Donna in warehouse operations, who heard it from someone in HR, who said that Merritt had looked at the end more exhausted than angry, like a man who had finally put down something very heavy and wasn't sure how to feel about the relief. Serena returned to the office 5 weeks after Daniel was born. She walked into the all-hands meeting that first morning without a podium, without a slide deck, without any of the usual architecture of a corporate announcement. She stood at the front of the room, 300 people on site, 200 more on video, and spoke for about 4 minutes. She said that Northbridge had been built on the work of people who had never had enough seats at the table where decisions were made about their conditions, their safety, and their futures. She said she had allowed structures to exist that she should have questioned years earlier, and that not questioning them was its own kind of choice. She said she was sorry once plainly, without using it as a pivot to something more comfortable. And then she moved forward. She announced the full implementation of Elijah's proposal, the insurance restructuring, the corrected overtime system, the field safety protocols, the emergency hardship fund. And she announced that Elijah Carter was joining the executive leadership team not as a symbolic gesture, not as a feel-good story, but because the company needed someone in that room who had actually listened to the people keeping the lights on and who had demonstrated twice now that he would tell the truth even when it cost him something to do so. In the back of the room, Raymond, the driver, started clapping before anyone else did. Donna joined him, then Greg, then gradually the whole room. Elijah stood at the side, not at the front, and kept his hands in his pockets. He wasn't sure he deserved a standing ovation for doing what had always seemed to him like the obvious thing. But he let it happen. He thought Diane would have found it funny. He thought Maya would have found it completely appropriate and would have expected nothing less. 2 months later, Elijah and Maya moved. The new apartment was on the 3rd floor of a building 12 blocks east, not large, but with windows that let in real light, and a small concrete balcony that caught the afternoon sun. Maya immediately claimed the balcony. She brought out a pot, filled it with soil from a bag she'd picked out herself at the hardware store, and planted a seed her teacher had given her. She wasn't entirely sure what it would grow into, which she found interesting rather than troubling. Elijah stood in the doorway watching her position the pot in exactly the right spot for sunlight, moving it an inch left, then 2 inches back, then nodding with satisfaction. He thought about Diane the way he always did in the good moments, not with the old, hollowing grief, but with something warmer. The ordinary, bearable kind of missing someone. The kind that means they're still with you. Serena came by that Saturday with Daniel, who was 7 weeks old, and looked, as Maya immediately pointed out, exactly like a very small person with very strong opinions. Maya held him with the careful seriousness of someone who understood the responsibility, and Serena stood on the small balcony with Elijah and looked out at the street below. "How's he sleeping?" Elijah asked. "He's not," Serena said. "I'm exhausted, and it's the best thing that's ever happened to me." They stood there for a while in the comfortable silence of people who had been through something together and didn't need to fill every moment with words. What was growing between them was real, and neither of them was in a hurry with it. They'd both learned the hard way the cost of rushing toward things that needed time. They let it be what it was. On a Sunday in late October, Elijah drove Maya back from her soccer game along a route that took them past the highway where it had all started. Maya was looking out the window, still in her cleats, shin guards pushed down around her ankles. After a moment, she said, without turning from the glass, "Is this where you stopped that day?" "Yeah," he said. She was quiet, watching the guardrail go by, the long gray shoulder, the ordinary stretch of road that looked like nothing now. "If you had to do it again," she said, "knowing everything that would happen, the lost interview, all of it, would you still stop?" Elijah thought about it, not because he didn't know the answer, but because she was 8 years old and she deserved a real one. "Yeah," he said, "I would. Even knowing how scared you'd be? Especially then." He glanced at her. "Because that day I thought I was losing everything. Turns out I was just being pushed somewhere else." Maya considered this with the particular seriousness she brought to most important things. "That's a really good way to think about it," she said in the tone of someone granting final approval. Elijah smiled and kept driving. The sky above the highway was clear. No rain today, just the open road and the city behind them, and whatever came next unhurried, unwritten, and entirely theirs. Sometimes the moment that looks like it's destroying your future is actually just breaking apart the wrong one. Elijah didn't stop on that highway because he knew how the story would end. He stopped because of who he was, because there are people who, when it comes down to it, cannot drive past someone who needs help and still live with themselves afterward. That's not strategy, that's character. And what this story shows us quietly and without fanfare is that character has a way of finding its way back to you. He didn't get a fairy tale. He got something better, a life that actually fit him. A daughter who grew up watching her father choose people over convenience every single time. And a reminder that the values we refuse to compromise, even when it costs us, even when no one is watching, are the ones that end up shaping everything.
If this story meant something to you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today.
And if you haven't already, subscribe and follow along. Every week we bring you stories like this one. Real human choices, real costs, real change. The kind of stories that remind us what we're actually capable of. We'll see you in the next one.